This week we take a rather quick view regarding child welfare policy in America. Actually, I'm kind of surprised this chapter isn't larger than it is. It's really pretty short compared to the other ones, and most of the content focuses upon child protection, which really is but one part of the bigger picture of child welfare in America. Child welfare can include, certainly does include issues about poverty, which we touch on a little bit here, and economic self-sufficiency for families with children. Um, Also, though, a more traditional child welfare, will look at things like child neglect, which and policies regarding neglect, which really isn't touched upon here at all. This really focuses upon child abuse and the child protection system responding to that. Doesn't really give a lot of in-depth kind of coverage to foster care and adoption, which are, although they're mentioned in this text, really, could have more coverage as well. But again, I have to remind myself this text really in this course isn't really about practice so much as it is about policy. But nonetheless, there are a lot of other policies that we don't touch upon here in this particular chapter. But nonetheless, we go forward. If you look early in the chapter, there's a text, rather a table in the text, in table 15.1, which looks at rankings of child well-being in the world among the economically advantaged nations. I think probably this has something to do with the OECD companies. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an organization that was established in the early 60s, I think, and involves 36 countries in the United States, or in the world rather. There are a number of different kinds of organizations of an economic nature, but this is one that I think is often used in terms of citing well-being statistics and issues about economics around the world. And if you look at this table, you're going to see that the United States, as far as child well-being is concerned, the United States ranks second to the last. Surprisingly, even worse is the United Kingdom, which somehow or other I would have expected to be better. But in any event, it's not. And so here you have a really strongly capitalistic nation, as well as one that is, capitalistic, but also fairly heavily socialized as well in terms of social services, sitting at the bottom here. I looked at some other data and was trying to get some tables brought into the lecture here that I just, because they're on PDF documents, I couldn't get them to copy for me. But it showed, for instance, one report pointed out that the United States, if you look at the income among households with children 0 to 17 children in the world, the United States ranks, I think, second in the world. I think behind, if I'm not mistaken, it was Luxembourg, but that may be wrong as far as total income goes or whatever. And yet, when you look at the number of the rankings of nations, these are again probably these OECD nations, so they're relatively economically advanced. When you look at the rankings of these nations in terms of child poverty, in households 0 to 17, the United States is second to the worst. So second to the highest in income with families with children, but second to the highest in child poverty in America as well. So it's a kind of an interesting juxtaposition of facts there. I think that was, I think, in, I'm not sure who produced that report, but it looked to be a pretty reliable resource at least. And so what is the reason for this? And the authors are suggesting that it really has to do with the fact that we have really no policy, no family policy in the United States that establishes a basic income that offers any kind of guarantee, so to speak, of employment for individuals who want to work who are raising children, and really lacks adequate social service supports for parents for a number of different kinds of programs that might be offered. Because of that, then, I mean, parents in America then a lot of times wind up having difficulty for their children, and so in some respects perhaps better developed, perhaps not, but we have a very large child protection system that includes foster care and adoption. that really the families rely upon very heavily because of that, because of the lack of adequate support. May not be the only reason, but it is certainly the largest of the reasons, I think. And the authors certainly seem to feel that way as well. As families are less and less able to provide for their kids, the demand for child welfare services are going to increase. So again, if we rank second to last among the industrialized nations around the world in that table, this arises from some of the statistics here that indicate, for instance, that about around 20% of United States children live in poverty, and mind you, many more are live at near poverty, so that's a very arbitrary figure when you think about the number of children that are just a few $1,000s a year over the poverty line but aren't included in this. Before the Affordable Care Act, the text says, and again, this is an unusual thing when they talk about anticipating the Affordable Care Act, and this text has a publication date 6 years after the, or is it 8 years after the implement? I think 6 years after the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. 8 years after the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, is still talking about anticipating and how it's going to change, whether or not it might change things. Well, in any event, before the ACA, the text points out that about a third of American children lacked access to health care because the family didn't have health insurance for them. By 2017, this figure had dropped to 5% with the expansion of services through the ACA, through Medicaid expansion, and through the Children's Health Insurance Program. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation website, and that particular figure comes from. So you notice again, Scandinavian nations near the top or at the top of the list of nations with children with high well-being, and they're the countries that have a strong array of social services for individuals and families. Look a little bit at some of the history in terms of how we handle child welfare needs in America. If you remember from your social welfare class, and maybe from my brief discussion at the beginning of the semester about the history of social welfare in America, children who were indigent or destitute, that were not able to live with their parents, or children who were with poor families, a lot of times wound up in what were called almshouses, which were just these facilities that communities had to take care of people that didn't have any place to go. I suppose it would be considered something of a shelter. Eventually, these almshouses developed into workhouses. If you recall, there became an expectation that somebody do something in exchange for their keep. Now, very early on, I think the what they call the child saving movement began, and the advocates for children in the 1800s began to recognize that they weren't appropriately cared for in these almshouses they were in, with a population of adults that had many problems, and it was just considered to be an inappropriate environment for children. And so a movement was afoot to get the population of children out of those facilities. And so by the 1870s, a new trend became what they called farming out, where actually these kids from the cities were put on trains and sent west to be raised by people who had farms. And the interesting thing about this, of course, was that the farmers needed, I mean, as the nation was expanding west in the 1800s, there was a real strong desire to establish ourselves out there in that new territory. And so additional pairs of hands were very useful to those settlers out in the west. And so, as is often the case with our legislation when it comes to needy people and to children, what looks like maybe being done in the interest of children also has a very strong economic benefit to the nation as a whole, and that's the case here. Now, as the slide indicates, this policy was really divided families and separated kids from families. I guess many of those kids never saw their parents again, and it certainly took them out of their communities as well and put them in another whole other area. Interestingly, just as a kind of an aside, I think I mentioned to you earlier that the facility where I worked in Central Florida was called Great Oaks Village at the time. Um, I'm sure I told you this before. Early in its existence in the late 1800s, when it was first created, it was called the Orange County Poor Farm. And so here you get a little of a blend of that almshouse kind of a thing and the farming piece as well. Working to the kids that were there were required to, to help work in the fields to raise the food that fed them and those kinds of things. These are things you wouldn't and couldn't do with children and dependent children in care today. You can't require them to work, but in those days that was kind of a standard practice, and so it was. I think just that whole notion of working being good for the soul was the thing that they really believed they were helping children with this. Children in the cities continued to suffer nonetheless, and most of you are familiar with the Mary Ellen case, and um, the what 1874 is the year I have here now. This is a story that is sort of one of those things that when you're on the circuit talking about what child protection is all about, people are always talking about the Mary Ellen case, and the story is that a social worker from some relief agency in New York City was called to a tenement building by a neighbor because she knew that there was a child in the home, but hadn't seen this child for years, and I think could hear the child crying and calling out for help, but never saw the child outside. And so anyway, the somehow or other the worker manages to gain entrance to the tenement and finds Mary Ellen, you know, malnourished and emaciated, chained to a bed, and I guess, and filthy clothes and all those kinds of things. And she discovered that she had no means legally to take Mary Ellen from that environment. She couldn't remove the child. And what she did was, and I think this part is true, she consulted with um, uh, the leaders of the American Association for the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, where there was a legal mechanism to remove neglected animals. We didn't have it for children. And so she looked for some guidance about how to go about this process from those individuals, and eventually had the courts approve the removal of Marianne, kind of based in part upon some of the ways that the ASPCA would go about taking animals away. Now, the legend goes that Mary Ellen was taken into court as a member of the animal kingdom, and under the ASPCA statutes, and that's not true. That's simply not true. But the ASPCA, I think, was helpful in helping the worker figure out how to go about appealing to the court. So the year after, this story, I guess, got quite a bit of attention. So we're told, at least that's how the myth goes, at least. And by 1875, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was formed. And it says here, by another 40, 50 years, about 60 such societies existed around the nation. Now these were, I believe, voluntary organizations. They weren't government-funded organizations. Um, Perhaps because of the concern about removing children from the community and from their families too far away, instead of sending children out west, the new movement around the turn of the last century was called boarding out. And I think essentially this was just placing children in apprenticeships with local craftsmen and artisans and those kinds of things. Again, most of these children, the text doesn't say this, but all the other things I've read at least suggest that most of these children were placed to work and to learn a trade and to work for, these businessmen or whatever. And so again, it was considered to be beneficial to the children. Well, first of all, because they're being given some structure and guidance, but they're also being taught some skills so that they can become economically self-sufficient. And again, this is where economics come into play. You really can't, in America, it's hard to separate child welfare from income producing children. It just seems like the two go hand in hand with so much of our history. And so this boarding out became more popular, and eventually became, a forerunner of what we now call the foster care system. But I think it's safe to say there were no there were no controls and little, if any, kind of supervision or monitoring of what was going on in these apprenticeships. And I'm sure some of these children suffered quite a bit in these placements. The Children's Bureau was established within the Department of Commerce and Labor. Notice the connection there again to income and work. The Children's Bureau was established in 1912 to collect and exchange ideas and information on child welfare. In 1916, the Child Labor Act prohibited interstate transportation of goods manufactured by children. See again, a commercial focus upon the situation, not upon really, the well-being of children so much. Now, interestingly, the Supreme Court declared this unconstitutional in 1918, and there was a conservative court in place, I believe, throughout the first half of the 1900s. And I think, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, it really got in the way of implementing some serious reform programs at times when the nation has needed it, and including when Roosevelt came into power during the years of the Great Depression. And this is another example of that. 1921, the Maternity and Infancy Act was established to help states begin programs to reduce infant and maternal mortality. Again, in 1929, Congress refused to fund it any further, and the Hoover administration did away with it. Jumping just a little further ahead than we want to here, but just to clarify, the child labor laws now, there are restrictions. If you are in high school or you're in school and you want to work, you have to sign a contract. The school's going to give you a work permit, and the employer has to specify what hours the child will work. Can't be during school hours, and has to have the approval of the principal, I believe, as well as the parent, if I remember correctly. And the idea, and it also restricts the number of hours that the child can work, particularly those that are under age 16. Now, this came out of the Fair Labor Standards Act that was established with the New Deal programs in the 1930s. So the Social Security Act in 1935 shifted the provision of child welfare services from the private sector or the voluntary sector to the governmental public sector. And there were really two primary provisions in the Act that addressed child welfare services. First, Title IV, which was the program that introduced the Aid to Dependent Children, provided public relief for needy children. These were cash benefits. This is the ADC, AFDC, now TANF program that provided cash benefits and social services that are administered that were administered by welfare caseworkers. Now, this was where a lot of the supervision of children in homes occurred, even though Title V here, the maternal and child welfare services being reestablished under Social Security, provided for the protection of care of homeless, dependent, and neglected children, and children in danger of becoming delinquent. You don't see anything about abused children there, by the way, because abused children weren't, well, child abuse, children were property. I don't know. I think with the exception of perhaps extreme cases, there wasn't really a lot of protection for kids in terms of the physical handling by parents during this period of time. Neglected children were obviously a danger, and they were a trouble to the community as well. And these homeless waifs running around and stealing to live and to make do and things like this. So it was for the betterment of the community as well as for the child to get them off the streets. And so Title V, put some attention upon those things. But supervision of children that were living with their parents was really occurring through the ADC program. And so these were where these welfare caseworkers were making these decisions about fit and unfit parents. And not only were they administering public assistance payments, but were also it's sometimes taking children from parents because they didn't feel the parents were living the appropriate lifestyle and that kind of thing, and not necessarily because they were being abused. We've talked about that before. So anyway, this comes out of this. Also, it's just of note for those of you that have worked in the child welfare system, and you hear about Title 4E, that this is something to do with kids in foster care, and whether the state has to, I think every 6 months, do a review with the parents and the caseworker of the child's case plan as a requirement for Title 4E. Here's the Title 4 that arises from, and you can see that child welfare is still blended in with AFDC. Well, TANF, I should say, ATAP. So, since after the Social Security Act, the states and the federal government really began to share responsibility for social services to the family, really until the establishment of welfare reform in 1996 during the Clinton administration. And after that time, the feds continued to provide some funding, but really, through block grants, social services block grants to the states, but really limited their oversight of the programs that the states were implemented. And this block grant program, by the way, funded temporary assistance for needy families. That's the TANF program that replaced the AFTC or ADC program that originated with the Social Security Act. Now, just as a point of reference, and I think we may have mentioned this before as well, at the beginning of the implementation of the TANF program, there were already fewer families. Families were coming off of welfare even as the program was implemented because of a booming economy at the time, and the fact that more jobs were opening up, people were going to work. But even in those times, at 1996, 68 families out of 100 that lived below the poverty line were receiving TANF. By 2011, some 15 years after the implementation of TANF, 27 out of 100 poor families received TANF. So even though they continued to live below the poverty line, they were not getting federal assistance for this program any longer. Child Protective Services, that is, the recognition of the existence of child abuse, really kind of traces back, I think, into the late 50s and mostly the 60s, and came out of, if I remember correctly, Colorado. Henry Kemp and Ray Helfer. Kemp is the one who gets most of the attention, but Helfer was also heavily engaged in this. He wrote the book, I think, co-authored a book with Henry Kemp called "The Battered Child," and it is a book that I'm sure is out in, I don't know what edition it is in now, but every social worker who works with children ought to have a copy of this on their bookshelf. And I hope you still have a bookshelf and it's not all e-bookshelves, but if it's an e-bookshelf, you should get it for your Kindle, because it's a really a seminal work on recognizing abused children and what to do about them. And before that time, what Kemp noticed in his practice was that kids were coming in with injuries, um, and he was noticing he would do like X-rays of their body, the long bone X-rays they call them, and find out that these whole body scans, and discover that there were a series of old breaks that had healed at different times in these children, and recognized that these injuries were not accidental. They were the result of abuse. And other doctors were seeing that as well, but weren't doing anything about it for fear of being sued for reporting, and so these children were being battered by parents and not being protected at all by the physicians that were recognizing them. And so this began to change, and Helfer and Kemp identified this battered child syndrome, and the concept of the abused child, I guess, became more recognized in the United States. So by well, I don't know what year it was, but all 50 states eventually adopted child protection statutes. The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, affectionately known as CAPTA, established the National Center for Child Abuse and Neglect within the Department of Health and Social Services. Look at this, it's not within the Department of Labor, for heaven's sakes, Health and Social Services. And it developed what was considered to be a model statute for the states to follow, and eventually all states followed this model, providing a standard definition of what constitutes child abuse and what constitutes child neglect. Um, Mind you, there is still a fair amount of interpretation um, possible with those statutes, but still they're fairly explicit. It establishes methods for reporting and investigating abuse and neglect. It established a concept of immunity for people who report abuse and neglect in good faith. Now, the in good faith part's an important thing. Um, a reporter doesn't have to be able to prove that abuse has occurred or neglect is occurring. Just that if reasonable people would think that it occurred, then that's considered a report in good faith. They just suspect it. That's a report in good faith. And persons who make a report in good faith, whether they be professionals or individuals, are protected by what is generally known as a Good Samaritan law, basically, that covers you if you do make it. Now, if you're doing this to to get back at an ex-spouse or something, it's a different matter. You're not protected there, but and the identity of the reporter, and I think this is true in all states. I could be wrong, but the identity of the reporter in Alaska certainly is protected. That's and I can remember in Florida, when well, and in Alaska as well, when I'd be talking to clients, almost the first thing that comes out of the mouth when you sit down with an adult about allegations that their children are abusing is, who told you this? Who reported this? And that's the one question that you can't answer, no matter how open you want to be about things as a social worker. So also provided a vehicle for and some guides for prevention and for public education, and CAPTA also established a system for tracking child abuse and establishing the need, because of all these statistics, the need for CPS interventions and funding. Um, yeah, so needless to say, a lot of controversies exist about how those laws are interpreted, when they are enforced and when they're not enforced, and what methods are used to enforce them. Um, it's a some would call child protection a thankless task, and it's certainly not thankless, because child protection workers are doing the work that has to get done to protect kids in their community. But the policies that relate to child protection, that develop the statutes, I mean, reflect the uncertainty that legislators have, and I'm not talking. It's not just true in Alaska, I can tell you that, but I mean, certainly in Alaska, that on the one hand, the legislatures don't want to imply, especially in Alaska, that the state has a right to intervene and intrude in anybody's private family life. The man's home is his castle, so to speak, and the woman's home as well in Alaska, um, but by the same token, none of the legislators can turn their back on abused children either, and so it's the confusion sometimes that exists, I think, in support of child protection reflects that um, mix of feelings that our legislators have about the intervention of the state in the service of abused children. There is a what I'd like to call a dual mandate in child protection policies. This is again true not only in Alaska but also around the nation. There's this dual mandate that creates a conflict for advocates for between rather advocates for the family preservation and advocates for child safety. And child safety is always the first consideration for a child protection worker, but a very close second consideration is the preservation of the family system. I believe I may have told you this as well before, but early in my career, I was told by um, a lecturing expert from the East Coast, not long after I became a supervisor in the Kenai Child Protection Office, said that the community is always going to have an opinion about what you do, and that if half of the community thinks that you're taking kids too quickly, and the other half of the community thinks that you're not removing children that need to be taken out of the home, you're probably doing the job you need to do. The point is that you're never going to satisfy everybody, and everybody's going to have an opinion about what you're doing. And so it is that really very well characterizes that push and pull that child protection people have to deal with, and any policies the state can do to alleviate that and to make things more clear would be really beneficial to those workers. But funding is inadequate for child protection. You hear about workers saying that their caseloads are too big, and I hear a pushback from people outside the system who say, they're tired of hearing about how the caseloads are too big. Well, the caseloads are too big. Whether they're tired of hearing about it or not, that is a fact, and that has to do with the fact that those individuals who are tired of hearing about it aren't insisting that their legislatures adequately fund and staff those positions. Legislators have said, well, you have such a big turnover, and so keep your positions filled first. And to the agency, they've said this: keep your positions filled, and then we'll consider whether or not you need more positions. You can't even keep the positions you have filled. The reason for that is because the demands are too great, and it's just so interesting sometimes how our policy wonks don't recognize that, or else just use it as an excuse really to move on to other concerns. Re- Rates of reports have gone up, and whether that's due to the fact that there's more stress in the environment, certainly during periods of economic, difficulties and things like that, the rates are going to go up, and of high stress and social stress and environment. Uh, could be because there's more information out there about what child abuse and neglect constitutes. Some people will tell you it's because kids are always phoning in on their parents. That's not really the issue at all there. Um, but all of these things, the funding, the rates of reports, the inadequate staffing, the high turnover, high stress in the job, contribute to a crisis in this area of work. And I don't say that in any way to discourage people from working in that area. In fact, I encourage you to do that. The bulk of my career was in child protection between Florida and Alaska, and the remainder of it was very closely associated with it. And so I can say that most of my, the 40 some odd years that I spent in the field were around child protection and child protection offices, if not in them directly. But as I like to say, somebody's got to do it, and I think that people who are educated and informed and who are committed to the field are the ones who ought to be doing it, and so that means you. um, um, but there is scrutiny. Workers who go into this can't be people who rely upon outside forces, praising them and patting them on the back for a job well done, because that doesn't happen very often. It happens occasionally, but usually it's quite the opposite. And there's a lot of scrutiny about and a lot of attention given to mistakes that are made, or failings in the system, whether it be from an individual caseworker in a specific case, or whether it be just the operation of an entire office, or the agency as a whole. Things like people, well, you aren't investigating reports. All the reports that sometimes children are harmed in those families. The decision was made early on not to investigate, and that has to do with the fact that that's got a lot to do with the fact that there isn't adequate staffing. Sometimes reports are called in, and the content of the reports don't fall into uh, the intent of the child protection statutes, and the screening process determines whether or not a report is to be investigated. And so um, if it's not a child protection issue, then that report is screened out. That doesn't mean that there isn't something going on, but the state doesn't have the information that it would need in order to intervene with the family legally. And sometimes kids get hurt. So reporters sometimes know something's not right, but really don't know what it is that isn't right. So that's one complaint. Sometimes. Reports are made with malintent, former spouses, people that want to, cause problems for their neighbor or something like that. There is I think, an overemphasis on the number of these reports, creating too much of a caseload. Most of the reports that are made, if they're screened in, they're legitimate. There are occasions where you get a totally invalid kind of a report, but by and large, most of the reports that are investigated uh, are seriously made and are legitimate reports. Drive-by closings that are mentioned in some states, where workers just have such large caseloads that, they run in and make a very cursory evaluation, decide everything's okay, and close it without really doing the investigation that needs to be done. Those can result in some pretty tragic circumstances sometimes. Repeat maltreatment of children after they're returned home. There are guidelines for returning children home. The state policy is that you don't have to have a perfect parent to return a child home. The parent has to be able to demonstrate the capacity for, I believe the term was a minimally sufficient level of parenting in order for that child to be returned home. Minimally sufficient. That doesn't mean this is really good parenting. It just means minimally sufficient. And so people will complain that children are returned home before they should be returned home. A lot of people don't want them ever returned home. You know how those kinds of opinions go, and so there's a lot of complaints about that. And again, sometimes those children are returned home and are the occurrence of maltreatment occurs again. They have to be removed again. That's one of the measures, in fact, that the feds use to measure the effectiveness of a state's program is the rate of repeat maltreatment. Occasionally, children die in foster care. Sometimes they disappear from foster homes. I think the text mentions something like 300 some children that the Florida foster care system lost. I don't know how that happens, but I mean, I really honestly, well, I do know that the Florida system actually privatized its foster care services. As I understand, they at least now they may have even privatized the investigations, if I'm not mistaken. But I believe that for a time at least, they were continuing to conduct the investigations, but had contracted with private agencies to provide for foster care supervision and management. And I don't know how exactly that works with the state's decision to return children, but I know that some problems arose from the private agencies not wanting to provide services because people didn't do the kinds of things that they felt they should be doing when this, you know, nonetheless services still needed to be provided to ensure the safety of the child. That's one of the conflicts. That's one of the problems with employing a private agency that sometimes wants to imply standards for accepting clients that screen people out that need to be screened in. Confidentiality is another big issue, blocking the public release of records. Um, Everybody seems to think when something goes wrong that the state's hiding behind their records, and the fact is that the state is not permitted to discuss cases in the public by law, and that's for the client's protection. Um, you know, the situations I remember many of them where a client would be unhappy with the decision of the agency regarding their kids, might go to the legislature, just might go directly to the press, but somehow the paper gets the story, and the paper runs the story about the state unfairly taking kids and keeping kids from their parents, and the state can't respond. The state's prohibited from responding by law, and there was at one time some effort to give the state an opportunity to respond. The fair right of response, I think is what it was called, when families took their cases to the public, but no change in statutes occurred, and so the public's hearing less than half of the story, and yet judgment is made, and and the paper says, well, the worker cited confidentiality for not saying anything, and of course everybody goes, yeah, 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 confidentiality. So number of different things that create problems for the agency, and many of these relate to policy or lack of clear policy, and could be resolved in many respects with somebody sitting down and kind of helping the agency through these things. And look at the history of child protection and family preservation and some of the federal statutes, and that kind of demonstrate some of the push and pull in policy in child welfare. So in 1974, CAPT is established that provides standard definitions and a tracking system for child abuse and neglect. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act (ICWA) was established that provided for native preference for placement of Indian children. This, and also the legal standards for removal and subsequent actions, such as termination of parental rights, are higher for Alaska Native and American Indian children than they are for other children. You have to prove to with more proof. You have to provide more proof, and this is all about preserving the native cultures and how the dominant white culture has overrun Native American cultures throughout our history, and Native children were being removed, Indian children were being removed from their homes, from their communities, placed with white families, and really robbed of their culture, and raised in these homes away from their village and from their tribes. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act was established to protect against that. 1980, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act focused upon a new concept called permanency planning, which meant basically that that when states removed kids from the home, there had to be a plan developed for what was going to happen to them eventually, and goals established to reach that plan. Whether if it's a return home, how are we going to go about returning home? And so the I say overdeveloped case plans that OCS and other child welfare agencies now have with their parents is really pages and pages and pages of legalese oftentimes. It comes from this, where the state has to provide what was known as reasonable efforts to return children to the home. That if kids are removed because of mental health issues, for instance, on the parents' part, and these have to be mental health issues that warranted removal. Not that somebody had a diagnosis, but that somebody was unable to provide necessary parenting for a child because of that mental illness. That services had to be provided to that parent that would help the parent get the child back home again. Couldn't just take kids out of the home and never make a plan and take action to return them. So that might mean reasonable efforts might mean making sure that the parent gets an appointment. It might mean driving, and in the cases of Native Alaskan and American Indian families, actually active efforts is required, where not only do the worker have to make sure that they have um, made an appointment for mental health services and are following through, but in some cases must drive the parents to those appointments if they don't have transportation. The state may be paying for services if the parent doesn't have the funds to do so. That these are reasonable efforts. So whatever the problem is, the state has to put in efforts to help that parent get the child back home again. This act also established subsidies for adoption of hard to place children, so that families didn't have they had less of a financial deterrent to adopting special needs children. These are children with special problems that often come into foster care, as well as older children and those kinds of things. So here you have policies defining where children are to be placed and what's to be done in order to get children back home. Um, Promoting family and safe and stable families in 1983, this act focused on family preservation and talked about the need to respect the integrity of family systems and do what is necessary to get kids home. Um, Legislation that President Clinton signed forbid interference in placement decisions except for tribes. Now, except for Native American tribes, forbid interference in placement decisions by organizations for reasons based on race. The National Association of Black Social Workers, for instance, was advocating for laws that required black children to be placed in black foster homes. Well, while culturally, and socially, that may be more appropriate, the issue is that there is a shortage of homes. This is also true with Native American homes and Alaska Native homes as well. There's a shortage of homes that are approved for foster care placement by in the minority groups. That has a lot to do with you know all the other issues about inequalities that we've talked about. As far as income goes and education and those kinds of things. But in any event. Um, this law said that you cannot deny a placement solely based on race. Now there can be other reasons why a placement is denied, but it can't be just solely on the issue of race, except again for Native American and Alaska Native children. In 1997, the Adoption and Safe Families Act mandates that the state terminate parental rights when children are in out of home care for any 15 months in a 22-month period. That means that if they've been returned home and went back into care, maybe returned home again, went back into care, if they were out of home for 15 months out of a 22-month period, now the state is required to terminate a petition, or required to file a petition to terminate parental rights. Now they can demonstrate that there were reasons why compelling reasons, I think is the term, for not filing a termination of parental rights, but they have to demonstrate that to the court. So now it's not that they have to prove why they want to terminate parental rights. They still have to prove that termination is essential, but they also have to demonstrate that if they want to keep children, they want to return children after 15 months in out-of-home care, they have to be able to demonstrate to the court that it's in the child's best interest and why that is. This is because if you go back to the 1980 legislation about permanency planning and reasonable efforts, as I read one time, um, as the 1997 Act was being passed, they said it was never intended for the social workers to keep forgiving failures on the part of parents, and the reasonable efforts didn't mean just giving them another chance and giving them another chance and giving them another chance. You know, social workers we tend to be forgiving souls and everything like this. And what's happened was that kids were growing up in foster care, um, particularly with substance abusing parents. Perhaps the parents were relapsing and kids couldn't go home or had to be taken out of the home again. And so the idea was to, that kids were spending too much time in foster care. And so the idea, again, goes back to that permanency planning, which is the other part of the 1980 Act, which was to get kids into a permanent situation, that is a guardianship or adoptive situation, or return them home. It's actually within 24 months of removal is what the standard is. And then in 2008, the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act uh, focuses upon the requirement that we use extended family for of the children for placement whenever possible. That's an equal requirement as well, that you place with family, if at all possible. First of all, most offices were already doing that anyway in the state of Alaska, but this said, you can't go find this nice family down the street who's got the big house. If you've got a relative who wants to provide for the care and it would not be harmful for the child to be placed with that relative, the relative is the person who gets the placement. So this kind of reinforces the family preservation policy. It also, I think for the first time, provided access for the tribes to gain access to federal funding for child welfare services, and that's been the issue with tribes taking more responsibility for child welfare, is the fact that the and you'll be reading some legislation, or well, a legal brief, I guess you want to call it, in this week's assignments link, about the changes in the statutes in Alaska, and as far as tribal control goes and tribal jurisdiction in cases where the state was involved, and how the two entities work together. But the problem is that the state, excuse me, the state was not providing, said they could not provide the funding for the tribes to really take over services as much as the law might allow. And so the tribes were kind of more or less forced in many cases to play a secondary role to the state because of that. Now, in 2017, and I think it started in 2018, there has been changes again in the Alaska statutes in regards to tribal cooperation. And ultimately, the objective here is that the Alaska tribes will be taking control of their child protection services, and the state is passing through funds right now. As I understand it, and I'm not in Alaska, I'm not working in the system, so some of you may know this better than me, and I hope you'll speak up if if you get a chance, and collaborate to do this, or to talk about this. But at at this point, there are kind of more background kinds of things that tribes are doing, like relative searches and those kinds of things. I think they're well, I don't know, they've been licensing homes all along, but in any event, in terms of actually conducting the child protection investigations and supervising, placing and supervising the foster homes, the things that the state offices are now doing, that's, as I understand it, is on down the road. It's, but that ultimately funding will be provided to, I think it's 18 different tribal organizations in the state to enable them to provide their own child protection services. Of interest, that might alleviate some of the problems with caseloads. My guess is, though, that as some of the funds go to the tribes, the legislature is going to look to cut positions in the state offices. So I'm not sure in the end that's going to help that issue much as well, but it certainly would return more control to the tribes. Um, this 2008 Act also encouraged the placement of siblings together, preserving family connections, and at the same time provides incentives to the states for the adoption of foster children, actually providing money to the states for the adoption of kids that have been in foster care. So you see, there's kind of a push pull back and forth there in terms of family preservation and getting kids out of families, and there are some conflicting goals kind of weaving through all of these statutes, some of which reflects kind of the change in attitudes and trends, I think, in thinking, but also, again, I would just say reflects the confusion that all the agencies have and many experts have in terms of what is best in child protection cases. This is an area for you policy wonks, the people that really want to pursue policy more than work with clients directly. This is an area ripe for some real intervention, I think. These innovations, and I had an employee once who would joke about the fact that he had worked with the system for a long time, and when a new program would come up, he would talk about, oh, this was so and so's program from 15 years ago. And what would happen is, in an administration, a new director would come in OCS, let's say in Alaska, and would come up with this grand plan of how he or she is going to change and improve child protection, and that person falls out of favor, moves on to another job, or the administration gets booted out of office. A new person comes in, scraps the new program that the last director had, or because it wasn't working so effectively, and comes up with another new idea. Well, if you look back, the new idea, this new idea actually kind of connects to an old idea a couple administrations back, and he would say that nothing is really ever new, and indeed, when you see about changes and innovations in child protection, I think there's a lot of truth to that. There isn't a lot being done that is innovative, that is new. There are new frameworks put on, there are new names given to things. There's a little bit of salt and pepper added to certain ideas that make it look fresh and attractive. But when you get down to it, you boil down to it in the end. Um, there's nothing new, and the problems that Alaska faces is the same kinds of things that happened in Florida when I worked down there, and I'm living in Indiana and reading the papers about issues in the child protection system in this state reflect very much the same kinds of problems that were going on in Alaska, some years ago, or vice versa. These are problems all over the state, all over the nation, rather. These innovations don't really have evidence from studies to show that they've been effective at all. The quote, the child welfare profession is especially susceptible to ideological movements that are implemented without the checks and balances of research and evaluation. Some years ago, a new agency was kind of brought in to help restructure child protection in Alaska, and while some of the approaches were different. Again, it was essentially the same kind of thing, just kind of looking at it from a new perspective and redefining a few things. Um, there a lot of questions were raised about whether there was any kind of demonstration as to the effectiveness of this model. Because it was the model that everybody was to follow, and in fact, there was a written document in their manual or whatever that said, people ask about studies, and we don't have any studies, and you know why? We don't need them. We know this works. Come on, it works. And And I was kind of taken aback from that, and I'm a person who likes the anecdotal kind of idea, about how, not that that fits with evidence-based practice, but nonetheless, there was no illusion here that they had any kind of studies to demonstrate their effectiveness at all. But we were going to go full forward in implementation, and it was going to change things. Um, Another interesting thing, and not to be critical of the Alaska system and its management, because they're doing the best they can, certainly, and they're good people that are doing this. But the idea of a single intake, where now there's a we when I started, everybody was screening their own reports, and determining what to be what should be investigated, what not. The community preferred that because if they were unhappy with the decision, they knew who'd made the decision. They could come to that person, who was me, and complain about it. Then screening was changed to regional, so that there were 4 or 5 offices around the state. All the reports would be called into those offices. That office would have had a specific unit to determine whether or not an investigation um, warranted intervention by the state, and then would send the reports out to the local offices. Local offices no longer had control over that. The decision was that the statement was made: abuse and neglect in Nome is abuse and neglect in Kenai is abuse and neglect in Anchorage. Now, aside from the fact that I don't think that's entirely true, that was sort of the philosophy, that we should be uniform around the state. I guess there were still, I don't know what caused this, but I've been informed that in the last few years now, everything goes through Anchorage. And Anchorage is the single intake unit now for the entire state. And that this is going to improve investigation and services and all of that. Well, just interestingly, Indiana has been going through kind of you know, problems down here, and a long story associated with that. But they brought in an outside organization to study the system and to tell the governor and other people what needs to change. It's like the fourth or fifth time they've done that down here in the last 10 or 15 years, I believe, seriously. And one of the first things the organization said was the problem was the fact that Indiana had started a single intake, and all the reports going through Indianapolis, and that none of the particular issues with the outlying communities was considered in determining whether or not reports should be screened in or out. So it just kind of made me laugh that and it isn't funny, but it just goes to show you that policy is just circular in this state, and policy and practice, and not in the state, in the nation, in this particular area, and really needs some intervention. I think some expert intervention. And one of the issues here too is, now, how do you complete a control group when you're talking about the safety of children? I mean, randomized controlled studies. I mean, don't they require that you have a group that's not getting a certain intervention, the others it is, and so that implies that that some one population may be allowed to continue to be at risk while another isn't. And I don't know. We accept that in like cancer trials and things like this. I'm not sure that would be accepted in child welfare. But one of the criticisms about our field is in this particular area is that there are no randomized control trials, or very few. There is not a single intervention that has generated a published peer review article based on a study in which they accepted referrals from a child welfare agency, randomly assigned them to a treatment condition, and evaluated the outcome. These are the kind of things that evidence-based practice demands. We're not practicing it in this field anywhere. Um, and the feds, when they come in to evaluate your program, and they do that periodically all around the nation, they go through avoidance of harm is really a standard of effectiveness. Child well-being is measured, but avoidance of harm in terms of avoiding repeat maltreatment and those kinds of things is really the primary standard of effectiveness. There have been, as I mentioned earlier, there's been some concerns raised about transracial adoptions, but denial of adoption for race alone has been prohibited, except in the case of Native American children. Frequency of adoptions within minority groups are impacted certainly by the lack of basic health, education, and employment supports for minority populations. Now, this leads to the topic of disproportionality, and this is a term that's familiar to individuals who work in the child welfare system in Alaska, but it is an issue nationally in child welfare systems where children of minority racial backgrounds are represented in numbers that exceed their relative proportions to the overall population. Disproportionality has been a source of quite a bit of study in Alaska. I mean, virtually the entire length of my employment, that was a focus of studies. Rates of substantiated maltreatment, entry and out of home care, and length of stay are all higher for children of racial backgrounds other than Caucasian. Family reunification rates and exit rates are lower for those populations as well. That's a concern, and well, what causes it? The immediate response is, well, there's racism in child welfare, and you'll find lots of articles, by the way, that talks about racism in child welfare, and it's worth considering and looking at. But I look at my the people that have worked with me, and I never hired a racist, and if I ever had found a racist among my group, I would see to it that person got taken off a caseload. I mean, I don't think anybody is deliberately making racist decisions. That doesn't mean, however, that that the systems of privilege isn't working and they're thinking kind of unconsciously in many respects. That's one possibility. I'm not saying it's the only, by any means, is the only reason for it, but that's one thing we need to be very careful about. Now, OCS's website tells us that about 55% of the children in state custody in Alaska are Alaska Native children, and Alaska Natives represent 15% of the overall Alaska population. That's a dramatic difference. A dramatic difference. Nationally, Native American children and African American children are overrepresented in foster care at a rate of about 2 to 1. In other words, if the percentage of African Americans are 14% in the general population, 28% of the children in foster care are African American, and Native Americans actually not quite as high as the African Americans, but the larger problem in the lower 48, thus nationally, is with African American children. Interestingly, Asian and Hispanic children are underrepresented in the child welfare system, and it's the childwelfare.gov says that it's not really very clear whether this is due to a lower occurrence of child maltreatment among those populations. Now, that's a possibility because sometimes there are protective factors within cultures that prevent child abuse. There are also factors within cultures where, you know, individuals kind of, they take care of their own, they kind of tend to each other. So if things are getting out of hand, the relatives may step in and, take kids into their care to alleviate pressures and things like that, more so in some populations than others. Could it be caused by underreporting because of the cultural perceptions that they have about the government or other groups? Um, or are they less likely report maltreatment to outside groups because of cultural norms? I mean, there's a number of different issues or factors which might come into play there. There's some mention of Head Start in child welfare. Certainly, as a part of child welfare. I just don't tend to think of Head Start as a part of child welfare, but it's a very important service in the community, and it was implemented, by Economic Opportunity Act in 1964. So the funding source and its origins really are separate from child protection. But the concerns had to do with the poverty programs of the Great Society, and concerns about the lack of educational preparation for children that were living in poverty. And so Head Start programs provides early preschool educational activities, some health and dental screenings, nutrition programs, and socialization experiences for these kids that would otherwise be very deprived and thus poorly prepared for the traditional schooling experience. And this is one area where, although I think Head Start's funding is always threatened. It's one area where at least there had been kind of a gradual increase in funding because as the economic situation is deteriorating in the country, I mean, there's more and more poor families, families living in poverty, and or parents of in poor families that are being required to go to work because of welfare reform. The reliance upon Head Start has become even greater still. But again, there's evaluations of the effectiveness of the program says that there's no indication that either high quality Head Start or low quality Head Start in any dimension leads to a program impacts lasting into third grade. Now, I don't know, as I read that, does that mean that it doesn't make any difference whether you go to a high quality or a low quality Head Start program, or that Head Start doesn't make any difference? I think the implication is the latter. I'm not sure that's what that statement says, though. And finally, just to look at some of the issues that are emerging in child welfare, and it's really kind of ancillary issues, I think, in many respects, which is, first of all, an increased need for daycare. Um, over 60, early in this particular century, over 64%, almost two-thirds of mothers with children under six were working out of the home. That's an amazing figure. Two-thirds. That tells you how much our society has changed. Well, it's changed a lot. When I was a little boy, my mom was one of the few mothers that was actually out there working full time, and she worked the whole time I grew up, but didn't when my brothers were younger, my older brothers. But most of my friends had a mom at home in the daytime, and this is just amazing. Two-thirds of mothers with children under six work out of the home. It's quite a big social change. So daycare, is increasingly relied upon. It's become more and more expensive. It's also sometimes unreliable, and it's very difficult sometimes to find a quality daycare. This is one of the reasons why many women on TANF are reluctant to leave the home. States are not using much of the social services block grant funding, the Title 20 funding. Only something between 7 and 8% of such funding is allocated to daycare, even though the states are able to purchase daycare for poor families through those grants. Maternal and child health is a concern as younger and poorer mothers give birth, and it really ties into the teen pregnancy rate. I think a higher likelihood of low birth weight babies with younger mothers and with poorer mothers because of lack of prenatal care often, and babies that have poor prenatal care and babies that are low birth weight oftentimes have higher rates of developmental disabilities, which becomes a huge expense um, to families as well as to society as a whole. Um, WIC program. Another program that from time to time has been mentioned for reduced funding or elimination, but is very vital to pregnant and nursing mothers and their children. Provides food coupons to make sure that in the earliest days of this infant's life and during the prenatal months that child and that mother have the health and nourishment that they need to or the nourishment that they need to start out healthy. But only about half the people that are eligible participate, and so this tells you that we need to do more to recruit people to advertise this program. And of course, the S-chip funding now. I guess there are mechanisms in place to make it more likely that the Medicaid, the children's health insurance program, will continue. But this is something, particularly in current trends in the federal government, I think we need to keep an eye on, make sure it's reauthorized. And even though our teen pregnancy rate is declining in the United States, we still have the highest rate of teen pregnancies of all developed nations in the world. And this is a big concern because teen mothers are more likely to drop out. They're going to have lower skill levels as a result of that, and that kind of just sets up this whole cycle of poverty all over again. So that's just kind of a look at the child welfare system in America. I guess I managed to keep you entertained longer than the chapter did. I hope that this was of some use to you, and I hope you'll let me know if you've got questions about any of this. Thanks for listening.